Welcome back to another episode of Neuroscience Digest powered by My BrainWise Coach. I am Bastian.
And I'm Phil Dixon.
And we are so grateful that you are back with us on another episode where we are going to take some of the research or some of the interesting things happening in the field of neuroscience and maybe even a little bit of behavioral science and understand what those new topics might be or the research behind it, and then apply it to our everyday life. And we've got a really cool episode today to talk about, which is keeping up with the Joneses, or the neuroscience of keeping up with the Joneses. But before we dive in, I just want to say thank you to our BrainWise community for continuing to go along this journey with us each and every day. We would just like, if you are enjoying this podcast and enjoying the conversation, rate and review us wherever it is that you get your podcasts. 5 stars is great because it helps others find our show. And then, of course, comment, share, and subscribe to our podcast, whether it's on YouTube, it's on TikTok, Instagram, or all of the above, because it helps others be able to join this BrainWise community that we've all been going along for the last number of months. Phil, as we go into our topic today, I'm really fascinated by this because we just recently talked about the neuroscience of poverty and what's happening there and things that, we can do from an empathetic perspective and just overall a really good general understanding conversation. And then this one, while it's not the same topic, it is adjacent to some degree when we talk about the neuroscience of keeping up with the Joneses. So let's dive in and begin the conversation.
Absolutely. And we're going to explore it, as we always do, through the lens of neuroscience, what's actually happening in our brain and why do we care? It is very much linked into the neuroscience of poverty, because if you're growing up in poverty, you probably look around you and everybody else has probably got more, got better, got many or more higher quality, whatever it might be. So what is it in the brain? Is it a social drive that we learn about, or is there something absolutely in the brain that's hardwired? So that's what we're going to be looking at today.
So let's define it, I think, Phil, for our BrainWise friends. What exactly do we mean when we say keeping up with the Joneses?
Everything is about a relative position. And it's our drive to match or exceed the perception we have of others, whether that be the size of their house or the size of their car or the money they have or how good looking they are or whether their hair is better than mine and whatever. Those are all going on non-consciously. And before we go that, not everybody has this to the same degree. Some people are doing this all the time, comparing themselves to others, where some people, I don't want to say they don't give whatever is the polite way of saying that, but they don't give much interest to it. So there's a complete spectrum of how people look at it on a scale of 1 to 100. But what it really seems to come down to is that, and there's been lots of tests done this way, is people would actually rather be seen as having more than other people rather than having more absolutely, but less than other people. So it's a sort of bizarre, irrational part of our thinking. And it's been one of the experiments was on minimum wage. And who are the biggest resistors to increasing minimum wage? You think maybe it's the corporations, maybe it's the people with lots of money. It actually turns out the biggest resistors are the people who are earning just slightly above minimum wage, because they realize that if the minimum wage increases, they may not have slightly more than everybody else. So it's a very complex, bizarre, it's almost non-intuitive about this whole process.
So Phil, let's talk about the brain science behind it. What's happening neurologically in those instances when we're comparing ourselves to others?
We've got a number of parts of the brain that are operative. And one of the things that tends to happen, as we've talked about, when the brain is, quotes, at rest, i.e. we're not actively thinking, we're not engaged, we're letting our minds drift or going into daydreaming mode, whatever you want to call it, the brain is actually fairly active. We think it's resting, but it's not. And during that part, we call it the default mode network. Our brains are tended to either think about the future or about the past, and we tend to assign is it positive or is it negative? And so we've got those sort of different things. We also look currently, or whether it's positive or negative, tends to be future or past. And we start thinking about what I'll call reflections about ourselves and comparing ourselves to other people. And so what are we actually doing? And we're probably picking up on various cues from other people and then comparing themselves to our own position or social rank, better that, better job, more opportunity, whatever it might be. And those processes trigger off two things in our brain. We've talked about threats and rewards many times. When we feel threatened, we can get a stress response, which actually then closes down our ability to actually evaluate what's going on from an objective point of view. And there is a thing, everyone's probably experienced envy and shame and things like that, but there is a thing called last place aversion. We don't want to be at the end. When, I don't know whether this happened to you, Cole, but when you're in a queue or when you're standing in line and you're at the very end, there's a different experience than when you're in the same position and you look behind you and there's another 20 people. That's it coming to you to play. Hey, I'm at least better than those poor guys that are behind me. I haven't changed my position at all, but I just feel better about it. And there's an example of it playing out in real life.
Really interesting. I can see that playing out outside of just wanting to, probably because keeping up with the Joneses can apply to wealth, status, education, a variety of things. It can also apply to people with what type of job someone might have or the career that they're in. Because I can see that being probably for a lot of people when they're in, we just were talking about the job search and the neuroscience behind that and how people probably think of that to some degree going, there's a sense of community probably for some who are in the midst of looking for a job together. And there's this community that they're forming. But then when one exits, there's this, I'm sure, some sort of threat response that's going into the other parts going, wait a minute, I can't be the last one to find a job. So what's interesting about it is that this kind of overall philosophy, I think, applies in a lot of ways outside of just wealth status and things like that. It's also being able to get to the goal or to what you're trying to accomplish, maybe not first, but before others are, even though I would imagine most people they are rooting for everybody to find a job and to do the things that they want to accomplish. But there's this kind of neurological thing that's happening in all of us going, we don't want to be the very last.
And socially, we promote it. And here in America, for those people who are in the rest of the world, there was an event last weekend called the Super Bowl. And we remember the winner of things, number one. Number two was pretty good as well. They got there not because they were shabby, but our whole structure, whether it be the Super Bowl or even the Olympics, the Winter Olympics are going on at the moment. 1, 2, and 3 is remembered. You don't remember number 4, who is also probably in many cases 0.001 of a second behind numbers 1, 2, and 3. They're good, but we don't remember that from an absolute point of view. Remember it from a relative point of view.
It's really interesting. And so that it just leads me to this belief or this assumption that comparison isn't just a thought, but it's actually, there's this full body neurochemical event that's taking place. And then that probably leads us to not remember a lot outside of those that are in the highest rank of competition or even outside of competition, but just in general, there's a large full body chemical event that's happening when we compare ourselves to others.
It's all going on, and it's all going on non-consciously. It's not like your prefrontal cortex thinks, I'm going to look around. Oh, yeah, that's a better car than mine. It's going on at a non-conscious level. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing is, I did mention the thing called last place aversion. Let's double click on that for a little bit of a moment. And and I mentioned that just now about the people that are earning minimum wage, etc. But it's something that seems to be, I don't want to say uniform, but commonplace, is that we tend to look at, there's two things in play. We've got empathy for those people that are in a worse position than we are. And so that's a big play, and we want to help. However, there's another thing that goes on equally in the brain, which says, actually, I want to help, but provided I'm still slightly higher than you are. It's not I want to help you get past me. for many people. So there's that sort of contradiction, there's that dichotomy of dynamic that's going on. And the other thing is we interpret all sorts of things and associate it with our identity. And feeling in last place feels like a threat to our very identity. So we tend to not want to be in last place. And I think that probably when I mentioned about standing in a queue or standing in line, that not being in last place in the line makes us feel a lot better.
Really
Bizarre,
interesting.
isn't it?
It is absolutely bizarre when you think about it, because there is an identity connection to a lot of the things that we do in life. And there's obviously a lot of sayings about being in last place and all the different things. There's someone has to come last, and just because you're in last place doesn't mean that you're bad for all these things. And I wonder if some of those things came out of obviously those who have finished last. And I will say there is obviously there's learning experiences that come out of not always being the absolute best and being the losing team. How do you lose gracefully and with still a good positive spirit, and what learnings do you take out of it? Those probably came from teams who had been in that particular setting, but it's also probably our personal way of going, okay, even though this happened, now let me make some sort of justification or some sort of purpose out of why this happened.
Yeah, I think there might be some, I don't want to say national characteristics, but I think there's probably something in there. Very much having lived...
1 second, Phil. 1 second. I'm getting a phone call. Give me 1 second. Pause. Really quick.
No worries.
Sorry. Okay. I did not want to answer that call. Okay, continue.
So, for example, if you compare the national thinking here in the US versus many parts of the rest of the world, it's very individualistic. And the rest of the world tends to be more community. And that's been shown in many ways. We may have talked about the big fish study?
I don't think so.
A guy by the name, I think his name was Nesbitt, did a study on the different thinking between Western-based students and Asian or Eastern-based students. And they were given the same picture and said, and the picture was of an aquarium. And they said, describe the aquarium. And pretty much all the Western started with a description of the big fish and then the slightly smaller fish. Whereas the Eastern and Asian students tended to discuss the background and the shoal of fish before they mentioned the big one. If you're spending all your time thinking about how yourself, you're probably more inclined to therefore think about keeping up with the Joneses. If you're thinking more about the community, it's probably you're less inclined to think about keeping up with the Joneses but rather how can you contribute to the community. I've never seen that written. That's a hypothesis I'm putting out right now. But I'd love to hear the thoughts of our BrainWise listeners as what is the difference.
It's really interesting, and I'm just going to share a personal hypothesis or belief, I guess, maybe to some degree. But I think this is what has happened over time, especially when you talk about what's happened, particularly when you think about focusing on the individual versus the community. There's this implied need for altruism, I think, in some cases, that economically you think about growing your individual wealth and all of those things, which I don't think we're obviously not going to be a political conversation here. But on the flip side of that, when you're in that particular experience, how are you then still focusing on helping others from a desire to help other people? And so how do those two things really begin to play together so that you do have a more common experience while still focusing on the things that you might want to do individually? So I think it's a really fascinating conversation and thought for our BrainWise friends to begin thinking about, and what perspectives they might want to share on that particular conversation, which I'm going to change our direction a little bit, Phil, but we were talking about last place aversion, and that's where this kind of discussion around community versus individual and all of that came into place. There's another kind of behavioral, I don't know if it's attribute or quirk or pattern, but it's relative praise versus mastery. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and how it's connected to the desire to keep up with the Joneses?
Yeah, so there's been lots of studies done on how people regard their positions at work. And we tend to, when we talk about what we value, And we've talked about this in the past. One of our things about our purpose in life is mastery of something or other. And we talk about how mastery is important. I forget who it was that said, hey, once you get to 10,000 hours of studying something, you become an expert or a master at it. But when they've actually done the studies, mastery is important, but what becomes more important in the studies is, am I better or worse than my peers? So it's not an absolute measure, which would be about mastery. It's about a relative measure, how I stand up with my peers.
And very interesting.
And we could possibly go back to, from an evolutionary point of view, if I'm in a group and I am the strongest or the best looking or whatever it might be, it may simply be that all increases my chance of survival. So it may be our non-conscious brain going back to that very survival instinct that I want to be better than other people. I especially want to be better than my enemies. That's a real survival instinct. But I may also want to be better than the people that are around me. Again, just a hypothesis.
Interesting. And then there was another behavioral kind of quirk or attribute. I think it's Easterlin Paradox, perhaps, maybe. But you want to tell us what that is and how that may or may not be connected to keeping up with the Joneses?
I think it is. And basically what that is, again, studies have shown that richer nations where everybody's earning much more and more don't necessarily translate to everyone's happier. All right. And so what it seems to be, I think somebody once said, it was somebody like Oscar Wilde or something like that said happiness is whether you earn slightly more than your sister's husband. And again, it's all this relative part of it. And basically, again, happiness seems, the financial or wealth portion of happiness, it's not just that, seems to be driven by, am I wealthier or more financially successful than other people, rather than how much money or how much do I earn? And it turns out that the people would much rather earn slightly $50,000 if their neighbor is earning $40,000 rather than $80,000 than if their neighbor was earning $100. So again, studies have shown that again and again. So it just seems to me, and that happens regarding individuals. It seems to happen in regard to the actual wealth of nations as well.
It's really fascinating. And what sparked in my mind, and this might be something we talk about a little bit later, is there's part of probably why there's a need to remind ourselves consciously in some way that we get a tremendous amount of joy or reward in this case out of helping other people, right? Or doing something for someone else. We've talked about that quite a bit on our podcast in various conversations. And so I don't know if we're going to get to this particular point. Maybe we probably will. But what just came to me is a way to help ourselves manage this comparison process or this whatever is happening from keeping up with the Joneses is create conscious ways to remind ourselves to give back to other people, to help other people. One, it takes us out of this perspective of constantly thinking about ourselves and our kind of overall social status. But then also there's a reward and a joy that comes out of giving back or helping another person in whatever way it might be. It doesn't just have to be economically, it can be in other ways also. So I just wanted to share that because there was a connection that was being made for me as you were describing that on how do we create this conscious awareness, remind ourselves to do these things to give back, because it does help us ultimately probably experience life in a more happy or joyful way.
And one of the things that we've talked about is mental models and how mental models come from all sorts of things, not least of which is proverbs and aphorisms. And I remember an aphorism when I was probably, 10 or 11, that said, happiness is making a bouquet of the flowers that are within reach. And I think that sort of comes to it as well, is, hey, don't look at what flowers might be at the top of the mountain or the other side of the stream, whatever it might be. What are those that are within reach that you can actually put together as a bouquet? That might be, if you could use that as a metaphor for not comparing yourself to others. What's within my reach, and I'll be happy with it. Doesn't mean to say you take away the drive to do something different that's not there, but you're doing it from an absolute point of view rather than a relative point of view.
Exactly. But I think what's interesting about all of this is that social comparison is probably going to be inevitable. I think based off what we just described, it just somewhat happens. It's part of our natural makeup. But being aware of what's happening can certainly help, because when we understand the neuroscience of these things, we can then choose when to engage, when to opt out, and when to redefine what success means. Because I think that there is probably a need in some case to compare ourselves so that we can, one, always compare ourselves to ourself, right? Compare yourself to your best version of yourself so you can continue to grow. And then there is probably a need for us it helps to drive innovation and keep us as as an individual moving forward and accomplishing the successes that we might want to accomplish, because we all do have individual goals, and that's a need, probably as a driving force in some cases. But again, I think it all comes back to what is the balance of all of this, which I strongly encourage. One of our kind of takeaways or tips, for at least from my vantage point, is how do we consciously create spaces or reminders for ourselves to give back, to be philanthropic, to help other people, because it keeps us from constantly being in this comparison space or this drive for keeping up with the Joneses. But then we also, though, there will be a reward neurologically to some degree that comes in from us helping somebody else, whether it's accomplish their goals or they need help with, I don't know, putting a resume together, or they need, who knows, pick your particular helping vantage point, but there is something that you'll receive out of it. So how do you create those intentional spaces to be able to give back?
Yeah. And I also think playing off of that, we all have sort of things that we want to go after, or goals we want to achieve, whatever it might be. And if you become too attached to that, you build your identity about actually achieving that, then you can feel like a failure if you don't. Whereas if you just turn around and say, that's what I'm going to go for, but I'm not attached to it actually happening.
Right.
So anyway, that's the neuroscience of keeping up with the Joneses. Is one of the best things to do is actually ignore the fact that the Joneses even exist.
Exactly. And I think it's also interesting because I can think of myself. I'm not really trying to have a bigger house or a better car or more money than the next person, but it does come into play when I think about my career, right? Or when I think about music. So I think it plays in different spaces for different people. But then again, ultimately, when we're no longer on this earth, none of it's going to have mattered anyways. The legacy we leave behind or the impact that we have on other people. So we can do that in any space. So that's also probably another aphorism, I guess, in some way to help people keep things in perspective, at least for myself. So this has been a great conversation, Phil. I think people will get a lot of good stuff out of it. Until next time on Neuroscience Digest, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay brainwise.
Stay brainwise.